Welcome back at the chess library. I was just searching the old bookshelves looking for a certain book by Nimzowitsch when I noticed something very odd. Tucked behind books on openings, positional play and endgames, there was a small collection of mysterious chess bottles, each labeled with just a few cryptic words: poisoned pawns, octopus knight, the bishop pair. I don't know who put them there or even why, but I decided to borrow them just for a little while, as I'm just too curious not to see what's inside. So let's take a look. Now this one right here is simply labeled poisoned pawns, and it looks to be filled with just ordinary pawns, but maybe it isn't quite so. Oh, I see now that there is a note attached to it. Let's see what this one reads. Do not ingest on B2. You know what? I think I actually know exactly what kind of pawns are in this bottle. So let's take a look at what happens when you capture the wrong kind of pawn. First, let me show you a few opening traps. E4, C5, here we have the Sicilian defense, D4, and white is going for the aggressive Smith-Mara gambit. Black here should actually capture the pawn on D4 and allow white to either capture back or even better go C3 and give up the pawn for good. But some players, they instead protect this pawn on C5, and now white can grab some space with this move, pawn to D5. Let's see now what happens if black gives the check on A5. White has not just one, but a few ways to block this check, and perhaps the most logical one would be to block with the bishop, as this also attacks the black queen. But now the queen drops back to B6 and says, ha, now your pawn on B2 is no longer defended. And here, in this position, the most common reply for white is to protect the pawn by going B3. But there is an even better move for white. Knight to C3. But does this not leave the pawn on B2 up for grabs? It does, but I'm afraid that the pawn right here is actually one of the pawns from one of the poisoned pawns from this bottle. So let's see what happens if black actually takes the bait. Queen captures B2, and it looks like this bottle is sealed, otherwise we could put it here, but let's just put it here so we can see what kind of pawn this was. Okay, so black manages to win a pawn as early as move 5, but it is a greedy decision. White's first move here is as natural as it is good. Rook to B1. And we immediately see one of the dangers of grabbing poisoned pawns. The queen is already almost out of squares. Actually, queen A3, this right here is the only safe square, but white is not yet done harassing the black queen. Knight B5, and black is in a whole lot of troubles. The queen is once again under attack, and she is also not able to protect this knight fork here on c7. And even worse, she is still on the verge of being completely trapped. Currently, she's of course being attacked by the knight here, and let's take a look at her options. a6 right here might look safe enough at first glance, but maybe you notice that now this knight fork here is even deadlier, because it's not just gonna win the rook, it's actually gonna pick up the queen. This right here is what we call a family fork or a royal fork. So that is not so good. The other option would be to go queen a4. And here white could of course give the fork on c7, but there's an even better, or at least an even trickier line, which is to take on d6, sacrificing the knight, but doing so with check. And once black recaptures, we see this beautiful check right here. This is a check. It's also attacking the queen, so she will be lost anyways. And notice how much the rook on b1 is enjoying the view now that the b2 pawn is gone. Okay, so let's look at the final move that black could maybe play to try to save the queen in this position. Because you might say, can't you just take another pawn, a second pawn on a2? Yes, but my friend, I'm afraid that this pawn too is poisoned and belongs inside this bottle. Because now rook a1 attacks the queen. This time she only has one square to go to, which is b2. And now bishop c3 seals the deal. The queen is finally completely trapped and probably full of regret of her hunger for poisoned pawns. Let's see another example of a poisoned pawn, this time from the London. So white goes d4, black replies with knight f6, and now bishop f4. Here, if black responds with pawn to d5, we have a classical London opening, but black can go for another pawn move to challenge white's center. This is c5. And it does not really make sense for white to capture this pawn, as black would be able to regain it either by going queen a5 check, which would also attack this pawn right here, or even just go knight a6, looking to take here with the knight. So therefore, once black pushes the pawn to c5, it is a much more common move and also a better move for white to simply protect the pawn like this. And now after c takes d4, c takes d4, black can now attack the undefended pawn on b2 with this move. And once again, the most common reply here is to push the pawn to b3. But this move right here would create some weaknesses on the black squares, and white has a much better option, which is to go knight c3, provoking black to capture on b2. This time though, white cannot go rook b1, as the queen would then be able to capture the knight on c3, and even doing so with a check. But there is another very nice way to punish this greedy pawn grab that black just did, which is knight to b5. And once again we see this theme that white is going to threaten a fork on c7, and the black queen is unable to get back in time to protect it. This time though, black could actually try to defend this right here with one of the knights. Let's look at knight a6 first. But once again, the fork on c7 here is only one of black's problems. The queen on b2 is also in grave danger, especially after white's next move. a3. This is what we might call a silent killer, not letting black escape to b4 with their queen. And after black maybe plays a move like knight to d5, attacking this bishop, white can simply let it be and now go for rook to b1. The queen only has one square to go to, which is of course a2, but now white has a very sneaky way to trap the queen, which is rook to b3. This move right here really puts the black queen in prison, and it is also threatening a little bit of a long way to trap the queen, but it's very effective. This knight right here could go to e2 and then to c1 or c3, and the queen here would be lost. But maybe, I hear you asking, can black not just take this free bishop and simultaneously protect the e2 square and thus preventing this knight maneuver? Yes, but if black does this, then we see that the knight on b5 will return to c3 to finally completely trap the black queen. So we can really see the consequences of her early pawn grabs in this line. But let's take a look at what happened if black started to protect the c7 pawn with the other knight. But what if instead of knight a6, black tried for this move right here, knight d5? This also protects the c7 square, and it also attacks the bishop on f4, so it looks slightly more active. But here white could simply retreat with the bishop, and once black continues their development with a move like knight c6 or any other developing move, white could continue harassing the queen with rook b1. We see that the queen right here, she only has one square to go. She is forced almost to grab yet another pawn, and now the move c4. And we attack this knight on d5, and once it moves, we will be able to give the fork on c7. So we could here just go knight c7, but once again we should keep our eyes on the bigger prize, which is of course the queen on a2, and we can actually trap her with a move like rook a1, queen b2, and once again bishop c3 seals the deal. The queen must pay a very high price for her pawn grabbing tendencies. Let's take a look at a final opening trap. Now let's investigate a potentially poisoned pawn in the Caro-Kann. e4, c6, d4, d5, e5, and bishop f5. And here we actually have a variation called the Tal variation, which begins with the move h4. This right here is threatening to go g4, and maybe even trap this bishop. Let me just show you what the idea is behind this trap. These pawns will just keep pushing until the bishop is finally completely trapped. So therefore, once white goes for the tile variation with h4, black should respond with h5, which is also the most common move. Bishop d3, and black can accept this trade. White will of course take back with the queen to keep a nice pawn structure, and here a move like e6, opening up for this bishop, is very often played, and white can develop with tempo by attacking this queen. But here black might do the same by going queen b6, of course reacting to being attacked by the bishop, but also maybe wanting to grab this pawn on b2, which is no longer, of course, protected by the bishop. And now white actually has two very interesting choices. The most solid white here would be knight d2. And if black then captures the pawn on b2, the slightly, at least, poisoned pawns, white can simply go rook b1. This is of course now protected by the knight, and this rook will be able to capture on b7 next, and you know, rooks, they love being on the 7th rank, and white should get a lot of activity even if black captures a second pawn. But there is actually an even more attractive choice that I wanted to show you, because once black played this move, queen to b6, instead of knight d2, white can go for knight f3. And this move right here makes the b2 pawn look even tastier, as once black captures, it's not just winning a pawn, it's actually also going to win this rook in the corner, as it has nowhere to go, and also white cannot defend it. Oh yeah, that's a good point, thank you. What about this move? This might look like the only move that protects the rook, but this would actually be a devastating blunder. Can you see why? It's a little bit tricky, but pay close attention to the way the queen and king are standing. They're in a slightly awkward position, one might say. Yes, very good. Bishop b4 white here would be completely devastating, as the white queen now cannot take on b2 because there is a pin, and here black would actually not just win a pawn or rook, but actually a full queen. So therefore it's not the way to go to try to save the rook in the corner. Instead, white should just focus on king safety and also getting this rook right here into action. Because now once black captures the rook, probably gladly captures the rook in the corner, white has a very sneaky idea. We just lost both a pawn and even worse a rook, but the queen white here, we can make sure that she will never go back, she will never be a part of the battlefield again. So we can play this move right here, queen b3, which is both protecting the a2 pawn as well as defending the b2 pawn. And there, the black queen has nowhere to go, and white will be able to play bishop c1 to bishop b2 and finally trap the queen. Of course, in this very fun, I think, variation, black does get some material for the queen. Black gets a pawn and a rook and even a bishop. So in theory, on paper, it should be an even trade, but the position is still somewhat better for white, and I think even more importantly, the results online, because this position has occurred thousands of times, white has a much higher win percentage. So it's definitely much easier to be white with the queen and the castle king. And you can see that all of the black pieces right here, they haven't developed yet. And that is also one of the risks of going pawn grabbing, that you might forget some development in the meantime. Finally, let's look at a very impressive and very intense game played between Fabiano Caruana with the white pieces and Alexander Lenderman with the black pieces. We had e4, e6, this right here is called the French defense, d4 and d5. And there are many ways for white to continue here. Caruana went for knight c3, and Lenderman pinned the knight with this move, bishop b4, and this is what we called the whenever variation. e5 and c5, the most typical pawn break in the French defense. a3, bishop captures c3, and b captures c3. This is all theory, and it's been played thousands of times before. Black has slightly better pawn structure, whereas white has, of course, the bishop pair and more control in the center of the board. And here we see queen a5. Eyeing the pawn on c3, and this pawn would not be poisoned as it would be captured with a check, and even winning the rook on a1. So Caruana cleverly decided to protect this pawn with bishop d2. And Lenderman, not wanting to be in this diagonal anymore, put his queen on a4. But notice that he's already spending a little bit of, maybe focuses a little bit too much on his queen. But on the other hand, Caruana actually also moves his queen now, and this is eyeing a pawn on g7 that also might not be poisoned, as it would also attack the rook in the corner. So Lenderman decided to protect this with the move king to f8. And here we see the beginning of a truly great game, h4. Caruana seeks initiative on the king side. Knight c6, and now pawn to h5. This right here is looking to push the pawn even further and ruin black's kingside pawn structure. But it has another very sneaky point, so pay close attention in the next few moves, because it is much more nuanced, much more clever than just wanting to go h6, because this of course can be stopped by black, and this is what Lenderman played, h6 himself. Now you should actually notice that black is also attacking the pawn on e5. If black were to capture the pawn on e5, white could not take back because the queen on d4 is undefended. So Caruana went all the way back to d1. Might seem like a little bit of a waste of time, but I will assure you that this h-pawn, this h4, h5 moves, they are going to have a very great importance in this game. Now Lenderman captured a pawn on d4. This is a pawn, and if Caruana takes back, Lenderman can decide if he wants to take back with the queen or even the knight. But Caruana, he argues that this pawn on d4 was in fact poisoned. Not because it opens a file in the same way that taking on b2 will open a file for the white rook, but because it opens a rank instead. Caruana continued with knight f3, and Lenderman captured on c3, also attacking the bishop on d2, which of course took back on c3. It's not just a logical recapture, but an incredibly sneaky trap. Remember what I said about the move h4, h5, and the pawn on d4 being poisoned? Well, Caruana is now threatening to go rook h4, which would amazingly completely trap the black queen. She would not be able to go back here, here, or here because of the strong white bishop pair. So Lenderman prevents this move by playing g5, controlling the h4 square. But Fabiano Caruana, he of course didn't reach a rating of more than 2800 without knowing about en passant. So he simply captured this pawn. Now, if Lenderman takes back with the pawn, that leaves the king very vulnerable, and also it would not stop rook h4. But he had a very sneaky way, or he had a very smart way to follow up, which was this move, queen e4 check. And once Caruana blocked the check with his bishop, Lenderman was now able to capture the pawn on g6 with his queen, thus emerging a pawn up. But notice just how awkward black's pieces are standing. The rooks in the corners with no clear path to become active, the very typical bad French bishop on c8, the lazy knight on g8, the very weird looking king on f8, not to mention the queen on g6, who might seem fine for now, but is not yet out of danger. Caruana continued his development with queen d2, and he now has the option to castle either way, which is kind of a luxury to have. Lenderman tries his best to finish his development with knight g to e7, but Caruana now once again harasses the black queen. Also, he is kind of provoking her, maybe tempting her to take another pawn, to take a second pawn on g2. So what do we think? Does the g2 pawn here looks like it belongs inside this bottle? Or should Lenderman call Caruana's bluff and simply take the bait? Well, let's find out, because this is exactly what happened. It seems like such a natural move. It even comes with a double threat on the knight on f3 and the rook on h1, but it's actually a mistake, and Caruana has a very neat way to protect both pieces. King to e2. Okay, so the king never got to castle, but he's perfectly safe on e2. He's surrounded by friends and family, and black's queen, on the other hand, is on very deep waters, and she must be very careful not to be trapped with a move like rook a to g1. Therefore, Lenderman placed her on g4, maybe looking to go back this way where she came from, but Caruana is not allowing this. He finally placed the move rook to h4. Not yet completely trapping the queen, but he's getting there. Queen g7 now is the only safe square for the queen, and it's not nearly as safe as it looks like, because now the final white piece enters the battlefield, and the queen has nowhere to go. He does have one way to save her though, which is knight to g6, but Caruana now just finishes this game perfectly. First he plays this move, rook f4, pinning the f7 pawn, and also threatening to take on g6, as white then would have to take back with the queen because of this pin. And if the knight captures here, the queen would be trapped, even though, because maybe I hear you say, but oh, can he capture here as it comes with a check? That is a very good point, but actually Caruana would just be able to take back with the queen. And now we notice that even though Lenderman won an exchange, the queen white here is trapped in this position, and there's no way to block the threat. So instead, Lenderman put his other knight on e7, protecting on g6, but Caruana has more pins up his sleeve. Now he played this move, bishop to b4, and pinning this knight, and there are absolutely no moves to fix black's position. Now Lenderman tried for a5, but now Caruana simply took the knight on g6, and Lenderman resigned in this position as he cannot take back with either the pawn or the knight, as they are both pinned. So he's losing a piece, and even if this queen move, she should be trapped in just a few moves. Now I hope that this bottle right here will remind you that greed is not always good in chess, and that some pawns in here are better left untouched. I will be back soon with another bottle from the shelf. Until then, sleep well.